Some of them were extraordinarily efficient, and they produced most of Russia's food. When the communists came in, they described those landholders as parasites, essentially, predicated on the Marxist idea that if someone had extracted profit from an enterprise, that they had basically stolen that profit from the people, say, that they had employed or otherwise oppressed. And so you could be a member of the kulak, K-U-L-A-K, K-U-L-A-K, you could be a member of the kulak class. And then because you were a member of that class, you were automatically guilty. And so what happened was, and you got to think this through to really understand what happened. So what happened was the intellectual communists were sent out in cadres out into these little towns to find people who would help them round up the kulaks. Now you got to think about what a small town is like, because so imagine you're in a town and there's 3 or 4 people or maybe 10 people or something like that who are a little more successful than everyone else. And a certain number of people are going to be fine with that and maybe even happy about it because they regard those people as particularly productive and, you know, as stalwart members of the community, regardless of their flaws. But there's going to be some people who are not happy about it at all, that are going to be very resentful about that and jealous. And so those are going to be people whose characters, I would say, are of the less positive type. And so when the intellectuals came in and described the reason that these people should be treated as parasites and profiteers, then it was the resentful minority in those towns, and that would be the kind of guy that hangs around in the bar all the time and is completely unconscientious and fails at everything and then blames everyone else for it. The intellectuals came in and said, this is unfair that this happened to you. You've actually been victimized, and now it's your opportunity to go have your revenge. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, in some of the villages, sometimes the peasants would actually surround the farmsteads of these more successful people and try to defend them, but that never worked out for very long. And so then these mobs, these angry mobs, would go into the farmhouses and strip the place right down to nothing. And they packed these people up and sent them on trains with no food out to Siberia, where there was no place to live. And so that they were packed into houses, you know, maybe they had a square meter each to live in, and all their children died of typhoid, and many of them froze to death. Many people died. Millions of people died as a consequence of the dekulakization, at least as a consequence of its total effect. So what happened then was that there wasn't any food produced. And so then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death in the 1920s, which is something you never hear about, right? You never hear about that. Why do you never hear about that? That's a question worth asking. You know, it was an absolute catastrophe. They used to, so these people were starving, right to the point of cannibalism, right? I mean, it was ugly as anything you could possibly imagine. If you were a mother and so you're supposed to hand all your grain into the central committee, mostly for distribution into the cities. You didn't get to keep any for yourself. And so maybe then afterwards, if you were a mother, you'd go out in the fields that had already been harvested, and you'd pick up individual grains of wheat. And if you didn't turn those in, that was death for you. So that's how far it was pushed. So that's a little story about how victimization, how the idea of victimization and perpetration can get out of hand extraordinarily rapidly. And so whenever people are beating the victim drum, you know, they'll cover that up with empathy, roughly speaking. We're speaking on behalf of the oppressed. It's like, maybe you are, but maybe you're no saint because, you know, you're so sure that you're a saint and you're only speaking from the position of good. It's highly unlikely. Anyway, so Pinocchio is enticed into believing that he's a victim. Now, the logical part of that is that it is the case that, you know, you can make a very strong case that every human being is in some sense involved in a tragic enterprise, right? Because you're biologically vulnerable. You're not what you could be as a biological specimen, right? You're full of imperfections, and plus you're going to be sick, and those you love are going to be sick, and everything ends up in death. And so that there's a very tragic element to that. And then by the same token, you're also subject to the tyrannical aspect of your culture, right? Because it's forcing you to be a certain way all the time. Socialization does that. You're required to modify your own intrinsic nature in order to come into conformity with the broader community. And you can think about that from the Piagetian sense, which is the socialization makes you a more and more sophisticated person. And there's some truth in that, but you can also be subject just to tyranny, you know, and I see people in my practice, for example, who've had very tyrannical fathers, for example. Sometimes they have tyrannical mothers as well, but they're not so much encouraged to integrate properly into the social community as they are harassed and abused and made to feel insufficient and, you know, basically subject to tyranny. And so it's quite, and that's true of everyone to some degree. You know, you come to university and there's a tyrannical aspect to it. Especially in a big institution like this, you're not really marked out as an individual in any sense. You know, you're a number along with 60,000 other people, and you know there's something cold and impersonal about that, which is well represented in the design of this classroom, say. But by the same token, you know, the university provides you with an identity while you're exploring an intellectual landscape. You know, you have a lot of freedom compared to the vast majority of people. Perhaps you don't have as much freedom as you might if you compared it to some utopian notion of freedom, but in any real world sense, you're unbelievably well protected by the university, partly because it stamps you with the identity student, which is a respectable identity, and so you can go off and educate yourself as much as you can. Well, and everyone in society says that's okay. They carve out a protected space for you. So at the same time as you're being tyrannized by the institution and forced in some ways also to adopt the viewpoints, say, of the professors, depending on the professor, you're also the beneficiary of that, just like you're the beneficiary of this huge industrial infrastructure that underlies everything we do. So anyways, the fact that your life is tragic necessarily and that you are subject to oppression makes the victimization story really easy to swallow. But then there's a dark side of that too. And this is actually what happens with Pinocchio. So what happens here is that he's told that he's ill and convinced that he's ill. And they do use trickery. And so again, you could look at him in some sense as an innocent victim. But the innocence, the filmmakers do a good job of hedging against the innocent interpretation, because what he's offered and accepts because he's ill is an easy way out. And so what the fox basically tells him is that he needs to have a vacation because he's sick, and he can go off to Pleasure Island, which is this place of impulsivity, roughly speaking, and whim. It's like reversion to being 2 years old in some sense, and that he really needs that because otherwise he's not going to be able to live properly. He's not going to be able to recover his health. And so what Pinocchio is offered is the opportunity to abandon responsibility as a reward for adopting the guise of victim. And that's really worth thinking about, because one of the things I've thought about for a long time is that I've been trying to figure out what gives people's lives meaning. And tragedy gives life its negative meaning. And nobody disputes that. Even if you're nihilistic, you're not going to dispute the fact that tragedy gives life negative meaning. So when nihilists say that life is meaningless, that isn't exactly what they mean. They mean that life is suffering, but there isn't anything transcendent about it that you could set against that suffering. That's nihilism. It's not that life is meaningless. That would just be neutral. It's like no one believes that, and they certainly don't act like they believe it. If you look at it technically, and we will as we progress through this class, that in order to have any positive meaning in your life, you have to have identified a goal, and you have to be working towards it. And there is a technical reason for that. And the technical reason, as far as I can tell, is that the circuitry that produces the kind of positive emotion that people really like is only activated when you notice that when you're proceeding towards a goal that you value. And so that means that if you don't have a goal that you value, you can't have any positive emotion. So technically that's the incentive reward system, and the underlying circuitry is dopaminergic. And when that circuitry is activated, then it's part of the exploratory circuit. It gives you the sense of being actively engaged in something worthwhile. And that's, you tend to think of positive emotion as something produced by reward. But there's two kinds of positive emotion. One is the reward that's associated with satiation, and that's consumatory reward, and that's the reward you get when you're hungry and you eat. But the thing about eating when you're hungry is that it destroys the framework within which you were operating, right? It's time to eat. Well, you eat, and then that framework's no longer relevant. So the consummatory reward eliminates the value framework. And then you're stuck with, well, what are you going to do next? And so the consummatory reward has with it its own problems. But the incentive reward is constantly what keeps you moving forward. And incentive reward, because it's dopaminergic, also is analgesic, literally analgesic. So if you're in pain, you take opiates, and that will cut the pain, but so will psychomotor stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. And so it's literally the case that if you're engaged in something that's engaging and you're working towards a goal, that you're going to feel less pain. And you can see this happening with athletes who are, you know, they'll break their thumb or something, or maybe sometimes even their ankle, and they'll keep playing the game. Of course, afterwards they're suffering like mad, but the fact that they're so filled with goal-directed enthusiasm means that, well, the pain systems are in some sense shut off. So that's an interesting thing, because what it suggests, I mean, then you could imagine, I might say, well, how happy are you that you've made a certain amount of progress? And if you think about it, what you'd say is, well, it depends on how much progress and in relationship to what. So hypothetically, you're going to be happier if you've made quite a bit of progress towards a really important goal. And then you have to think through what it means for a goal to be really important, because that's not obvious. Now, you could say, you're in this class and you're listening to some information, and maybe there's two reasons for that. You might find the information interesting per se, but let's forget about that for a minute. You need to listen to the information so that you can do well on the assignment, so that you can do well in the class. You need to do well in your classes so that you can finish up your degree. You need to finish up your degree so that you can find your place in the world. You need to do that so that you're financially stable, and maybe you can start a family and have a life, and that's all part of being a good person, something like that. And so that's a hierarchy of goals, and you might say that being a good person would be the thing, however vaguely thought through, that's at the top of that hierarchy. And then when you're doing things that serve that ultimate purpose, then you're going to find those more meaningful, and that meaning is actually produced as a consequence of the engagement of this exploratory circuit that's nested right down in your hypothalamus. It's really, really old. It's as old as thirst, and it's as old as hunger. It's really an old system. And so you want to have that thing activated. I mean, at least well, it isn't only from a hedonic point of view. You know, it isn't a matter of being happy. It's the wrong way of thinking about it. It's much more complicated than that. It's, yes?
I was just about to ask, like, bring up, like, the hedonic element.
Yeah.
Because I'm just trying to understand this, I guess, not relationship, but the differentiation between hedonism and satiation. And you, like, going back to when you mentioned that it's not that life is meaningless.
Yeah.
But hedonism isn't exactly, like, it's not satiation, because at that point people are just doing what they're doing for the sake of doing. It's not just for activation of the dopaminergic system.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand.
Well, what I would say, we're going to go into that a lot once we're done this, like a lot. But I'll go over it briefly. I mean, it's not merely hedonism, because there's an analgesic and also a fear-reducing element to pursuing the proper path, right? So there's control of negative emotion. But there's not just control of negative emotion and generation of positive emotion in the immediate future, which is kind of what you'd think about with regards to hedonism. Actually, Pinocchio takes a hedonic route next. The problem with the hedonic route is that, so the pursuit of pure happiness, let's say, is that what makes you happy in the next minute might not be something that will make you happy in the next hour. Well, you know that. There's this comic, what's his name? They called him King of the One-Liners. He talked about drinking wine. He said, don't you know that's going to cause a hangover? And he said, yeah, at the end, but the beginning and middle are excellent. And so that's really the problem with hedonism, right? Is that to pursue something that makes you happy in the immediate present risks sacrificing your, well, many things, but at least, let's say, your hedonism in the medium to long term. And of course, that is one of the major problems with drug use. And alcohol is a really good example of that, because whatever hedonic kick you might get from it that moment at night, you're going to pay for almost completely, or maybe even more so, because the next day you're much more jittery and anxious. And that's a that's a direct consequence of withdrawing from the drug. So when you have a hangover, you're in alcohol withdrawal.